The photograph stopped me cold. Not the building itself, though the building was extraordinary. It was the towers, dozens of them, rising from rooftops across a city that supposedly didn't know electricity yet. I found this image while researching something else entirely. And once I saw it, I could not unsee it. That's not decoration. That's infrastructure. The year stamped on the archive catalog, 1867. The location, a city in the American Midwest. A city built, according to every official textbook, by settlers who had arrived only decades before, hauling timber and iron and sweat into a wilderness. And yet the buildings in this photograph are enormous. Ornate, domed, columned, and wired, if the towers mean what I think they mean, into something vast and invisible. What we were never taught is that the grid may have already existed, and that it ran on something entirely different from what we pay for today. The official story goes like this. Human civilization stumbled toward electrical power slowly, painfully, and brilliantly. Benjamin Franklin flew a kite in a thunderstorm. Michael Faraday discovered electromagnetic induction. Thomas Edison built the first commercial power station on Pearl Street in Manhattan in 1882. And from there, the modern electrical grid grew outward, wire by wire, pole by pole, decade by decade, until it blanketed the industrialized world. It is a story of genius and commerce and competition. The war of currents between Edison and Westinghouse. The triumph of alternating current. The slow rural electrification of the 20th century. The great grid we know today, the one that runs through every wall of every building, is presented as the hard-won achievement of modern engineering, built from nothing over roughly 150 years. That is the story. It is taught in schools. It is repeated in textbooks. It has been the dominant explanation for so long that questioning it feels almost absurd. Almost. Let's start with the numbers. Because the numbers are not subtle. In 1893, the world's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago. They called it the White City. 14 months of construction. An entire self-contained civic district built on 690 acres of reclaimed lakefront swampland. 200 buildings. 43 countries represented. And at night, this is the part that matters. Lit by 100,000 incandescent bulbs powered by an alternating current system that contemporary observers called nothing short of miraculous. The official explanation credits Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse, who famously won the contract to electrify the fair and demonstrated AC power at scale for the first time. But here is what that explanation glosses over. The White City was not wired the way cities were wired in 1893. There were no above-ground transmission lines marring those famous photographs. The power distribution was, by every account, embedded in the infrastructure in ways that engineers at the time described as unprecedented. Visitors reported that light emanated from architectural elements themselves. From columns. From the domes. Where was the source? The substations were enormous. The machinery inside them was never fully disclosed to the public. And then, 6 months after closing, the White City burned. Almost completely. In a fire whose origin has never been definitively explained. The timing is almost theatrical. Speaking of disappeared infrastructure, there is a name that appears again and again in 19th century architectural records from cities across Europe, the Americas, and Central Asia. That name is Tartary, or Tartaria, or the Grand Tartary, in maps drawn between the 16th and 18th centuries. Maps held today in archives from the British Library to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. There is a vast territory labeled Tartaria Magna, Grand Tartary. It occupies the center of the Eurasian continent in some maps, but in others, the label appears in the Americas. In Africa, in territories that should, by the colonial logic of the era, have been empty wilderness. The mainstream explanation for this is terminological confusion. Tartary, scholars say, was simply a catch-all European term for Central Asian steppe peoples, Mongols, Turks, assorted nomads, and the name was applied loosely, inconsistently, and eventually dropped as cartography became more precise. That is the official explanation. It is reasonable. It is orderly. But here is what no one explains. Why? In the 1828 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, a document sitting in university libraries around the world, does the entry for Tartary run to 6 full columns? 6 columns of dense descriptive text about a supposed geographic fiction that was, by that point, supposedly already understood to be a mistake? Why describe, in careful detail, the administrative structure of a civilization that wasn't there? And why, by the 1900 edition of that same encyclopedia, is the entry gone entirely? Which brings me to the towers. I spent weeks trying to understand what those rooftop civic structures, the domed railway stations, the colonnaded courthouses, the immense exhibition halls that appear in city after city across the globe in the late 19th century, was officially attributed to a French school of design that peaked in the 1880s and 1890s. The official story says teams of trained architects designed and constructed these buildings, usually within a decade, at tremendous expense. But when researchers have attempted to price out the construction of these buildings using period-accurate labor and material costs, the numbers don't work. The limestone quarrying alone for some of these structures would have required more man-hours than contemporary labor records show were available. The precision of the stonework, in some cases, exceeds what the masonry tools of the era were capable of producing at speed. Maybe these buildings were not built by the civilization that inherited them. Maybe they were found. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But Nikola Tesla knew something. The biographical record is clear on this, even if its implications are not. Tesla spent the last decades of his productive life, the years between roughly 1899 and 1917, obsessed with a single project, the Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island. The official history frames Wardenclyffe as Tesla's great failure, a grandiose attempt at global wireless communication that ran out of funding and was demolished in 1917 to pay debts. That framing is technically accurate. What it omits is what Tesla said the tower was actually for. In his own correspondence, letters held today at the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade, partially digitized and available to researchers, Tesla described Wardenclyffe not primarily as a communication device, but as a resonance amplifier. He wrote, in a letter to his primary financier J.P. Morgan, that the tower was designed to interact with what he called the standing waves of the Earth's electrical field, that it would draw power from the resonance between the ionosphere and the ground. He used a specific phrase, the existing system. What existing system? Tesla built Wardenclyffe from scratch, on a potato farm on Long Island. What system did he believe already existed that his tower was meant to connect to? In 1901, before construction had even begun in earnest, J.P. Morgan withdrew his funding. The project died. The tower was demolished during World War I under circumstances that Tesla disputed until his death. Morgan, it should be noted, had significant financial interests in Edison General Electric. The metered power grid, the one where you pay for every kilowatt, was his investment. A system that drew energy from the Earth itself, freely, for anyone with a receiver, would have destroyed that investment entirely. The institutional record of what Tesla actually found, actually built, and actually understood does not survive cleanly. His laboratory in Colorado Springs, where he conducted the experiments that informed Wardenclyffe, was dismantled after he left in 1900. His New York laboratory burned in 1895. His papers, upon his death in 1943, were seized by the Office of Alien Property, despite Tesla having been an American citizen for decades and held classified for years. That's not misfortune. That's a pattern. The mud flood theory sits in a strange place, dismissed immediately by mainstream historians, yet supported by a category of evidence that has no clean official explanation. The theory, in brief, suggests that at some point in the 18th or early 19th century, a catastrophic event covered the lower floors of buildings across much of the northern hemisphere in sediment. Evidence cited includes the extraordinarily high proportion of 19th century buildings across Europe and Central Asia whose first floors are partially or fully underground, with windows that open below street level. Excavation records showing that streets in cities like London, Paris, and Istanbul were raised by several feet during official city renovation projects in the 1800s. with remarkably little bureaucratic documentation of where all that fill came from, and the consistent appearance, in photographs from the 1860s onward, of what appeared to be fully intact neoclassical buildings already showing centuries of weathering, in cities that the official record insists were only founded decades before. Structures in the 19th century archive photographs actually were. At first, I accepted the standard explanations: ventilation shafts, lightning rods, decorative finials. Architecture historians call them by a dozen different names. But then a pattern started emerging across photographs from cities I had no reason to connect. The same structural forms appearing in St. Louis in 1876. Here is where the threads converge, and I want to be careful about how I say this. The pattern I keep encountering across photographic archives, architectural surveys, Tesla's suppressed correspondence, the gap-riddled maps of Tartary, the disappeared first floors of cities on multiple continents, suggests the possibility of a prior civilization that had solved the problem of energy distribution in a fundamentally different way. Not through wires and meters, through resonance, through the Earth itself. Maybe that civilization was Tartaria, whatever Tartaria actually was. Maybe it was something older. Maybe the grand buildings we inherited, the ones too large to have been built in a decade, too precisely made for the tools that supposedly built them, are the remnant infrastructure in Buenos Aires in the 1880s. In photographs of supposed frontier towns in the American West taken before those towns had any verified electrical infrastructure. In images of buildings in Central Asia labeled with dates that precede the first verified electrical installation in those regions by 30, 40, sometimes 60 years. That's not coincidence. That's not decorative fashion. The pattern indicates a distributed network, towers placed at regular intervals on buildings of a specific architectural type, in cities that share almost nothing else in common except the buildings themselves. Those buildings. Here's the part that keeps me up at night. The architectural style scholars call Beaux-Arts the grand. Mainstream historians attribute the sunken first floors to deliberate construction practice, raising street grades for drainage and sanitation purposes. It is a reasonable explanation. It does not explain why, in some cases, those subterranean first floors contain fireplaces, decorative plasterwork, ornate windows, architectural elements that serve no purpose in a basement and every purpose in a ground-level room intended for habitation. Something, at some point, covered the ground floor of a civilization. The question is when, and whether the civilization that emerged afterward of a system we no longer understand. And maybe, when that system was destroyed, whether by catastrophe, by conquest, or by the deliberate decisions of men who had already calculated what a metered grid would be worth, the knowledge of how to access the Earth's free energy field went with it. The architecture remained. The towers remained, at first, though most were removed during the renovation projects of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Tesla found the signal, or a remnant of it, in Colorado Springs. He tried to build an amplifier for it. That amplifier was stopped, its records seized, its funding pulled by the man who owned the alternative. And we were given, instead, the metered grid. Alternating current. Monthly bills. Infrastructure owned by corporations and governments whose interests are served, precisely and completely, by a system where every unit of energy is tracked, sold, and charged for. That's not the story of a free civilization that invented electricity. That's the story of a captured one that was sold it back. I don't have answers, only patterns. The archive photographs are real. You can find many of them yourself, in the digital collections of the Library of Congress, in the Europano Archive, in the holdings of regional historical societies that have quietly digitized their 19th century collections without much fanfare. Look at the rooftops. Look at the towers. Look at how the buildings are distributed across cities that were supposedly built from nothing. The encyclopedia entries are real. The 1828 Britannica on Tartary. The vanishing of that entry. The maps. The 6 columns that describe administrative systems for a civilization historians say was a cartographic error. Tesla's correspondence is real, or rather, what survived of it is. The Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade holds what was returned to his estate after the classified period ended. Researchers have noted that the collection, while substantial, has significant gaps in the correspondence from 1899 to 1905, the years of the Colorado Springs experiments and the early Wardenclyffe period. What was in those letters? What did Tesla understand, in those years, about the existing system? The White City burned. Wardenclyffe was demolished. Tesla's papers were seized. The towers on the rooftops came down during renovations. The first floors of 1,000 buildings remain underground, their windows opening onto dirt, their fireplaces sealed. And somewhere, perhaps in a filing cabinet at a federal agency, perhaps in a private archive that has never been opened to public researchers, perhaps in the digital records of a corporation whose charter stretches back to the men who funded the metered grid, the documentation of what was known, what was found, and what was destroyed sits buried in plain sight. The grid they gave us runs on billed electricity. It poisons the air it's generated from. It concentrates wealth at its source. It cannot be accessed except through payment. The grid that may have existed before runs on something already present in the earth, something Tesla detected, something the towers may have harvested, something that costs nothing because it belongs, in some fundamental sense, to everyone who lives on the surface of this planet. I cannot tell you that civilization was destroyed deliberately. I cannot tell you the men who built the metered grid knew what they were replacing. I cannot tell you the mud covered the old world, or that the Tartarian maps describe something real. What I can tell you is that the pattern is there, that the numbers don't quite add up, that the gaps in the record appear consistently, at exactly the points where they would need to appear if someone, at some point, had decided the old knowledge was too dangerous to leave intact, and that the towers, whatever they were, are gone. Every last one of them. I don't have answers, only patterns. The pattern says, somewhere in the lower Mississippi Valley in 1926, an old woman sat with a government researcher and spoke for long enough to make him write very fast. The pattern says her words were important enough to cite 3 times in a published academic work and important enough to disappear from every repository where they should exist. The pattern says the institutional infrastructure for managing exactly this kind of disappearance demonstrably existed and was actively considered in the years immediately following her interview. The pattern says her name may have been Celestine. The pattern says she was not afraid. The pattern says she had been waiting for someone to ask. And the pattern says that what she was asked, and what she answered, and what she remembered from before the Americans came and surveyed the land and decided what was real, all of it is sitting in a shape. The shape of 3 citations to a missing manuscript. The shape of an empty folder with a label. The shape of a recording from 1947, a woman's voice describing her grandmother, saying, "Some things, they let you say only once." The photograph is still in the monograph. The chair, the hands, the stillness that is a form of survival. She is looking directly at the camera, not at whoever is holding it, but through it, as if she knows that the person who will eventually matter is not the one in the room with her, but the one who will open the book decades later, find the footnote, follow the absence, and ask the question she had been waiting for someone to ask. I'm asking, and the silence answers in exactly the shape I was afraid it would.